there. We are not sure, to be honest, if some rescue workers have tried to go beyond that point as yet. When we spoke to the head of the Port Authority Police, that would be the organization that is in charge of the World Trade Center building itself, the Port Authority Police chief told us that they were at that point, about, I'd say 40 minutes ago, about to make a decision on whether or not it was safe to send emergency workers back in there. But the bottom line is that according to the chief of safety of the New York City Fire Department, he says that he probably lost a great many men in those secondary explosions, and he said that there were literally hundreds, if not thousands of people in those two towers when the explosions took place. He said everything above the 60th floor was extremely difficult to get to, as you can imagine.
Pat Dawson.
Back to you.
Pat Dawson, thanks very much. We have some videotape, I understand, that we're going to show you from the West Bank. These are Palestinian celebrations in the wake of Tuesday's terror attacks in the United States. Apparently, Palestinians took to the street chanting, "God is great." People were throwing candy, distributing candy to passersby. The U.S. government obviously has become increasingly unpopular, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, because Palestinians feel that the U.S. government has sided with Israel. One man, Nawal Abdel Fattah, wearing a long black dress, threw sweets in the air saying, actually that's a woman, pardon me, saying she was happy because, quote, America is the head of the snake. America always stands by Israel in its war against us. Meanwhile, Yasser Arafat emerged to speak with reporters ahead of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He said, "We are completely shocked. It's unbelievable. We completely condemn this very dangerous attack, and I convey my condolences to the American people, to the American president, and to the American administration, not only in my name, but on behalf of the Palestinian people."
And this comes on a day, Katie, in which obviously there's been a steady deterioration of the situation in the Middle East, but Shimon Peres was to meet today with Yasser Arafat in the West Bank. There has been some criticism of the Bush administration for not getting more involved in the peacemaking efforts in the Middle East in the past few weeks from within the Republican Party as well.
Because it has gotten increasingly volatile.
It has. There's been a steady escalation of violence, incursions by Israelis into Palestinian towns and declaring martial law and then pulling back. And everyone thought that the bomb was ticking in the Middle East. No one expected anything of these kinds of. We're going to have some profound changes in America, Senator.
I'm afraid so. I think that our lifestyles will not be the same for a very long period of time because of security requirements. I also think that, as I was watching you earlier, there is going to have to be an evaluation about our intelligence capability, and part of that evaluation will be recognition that we don't have the kind of human intelligence capabilities that perhaps we need. We have excellent technical capabilities, but a lot of times you have to have someone on the ground to penetrate these organizations so you can know their intentions rather than their actions. But look, this is a terrible, unspeakable act. I believe the American people will rally behind and support the President of the United States. And I believe that we will find out who did this, and I think we will respond. And I don't know how you could describe it, very frankly, any other way but an act of war.
You grew up in the conventional military, and we have such an investment in all of that. But for some time, national security officials across all administrations have been saying the great threat to this country is terrorism. Have we devoted enough attention to this kind of an act?
It's very difficult for me to second guess. I think there's going to be plenty of that kind of activity. I would repeat that when I talk to people in the field and when I travel around the world, our lack of human intelligence capability, part of that is the difficulty in penetrating.
You know, the main source of support for Israel, it isn't isolated just in certain states. And you know, any one of those people, if you got them aside and asked them truthfully, they would tell you that they were not in favor of our policies with regard to Israel.
So do you think that probably was the cause of all this continual escalation that has been going on between Palestine and Israel? And there's been an absence of participation, I think that it's fair to say, on the part of this administration and all that.
Well, I think that's kind of speculation at this time. I certainly think that that you know, the reason why the United States is hated in so many places in the Middle East is with regard to the support of the state of Israel. And as a matter of fact, they'll openly state that if Israel had not had the support of the United States, it wouldn't exist today. So they go so far as to say that.
There are people, many people, still trapped.
When you and I were talking earlier, we were commenting on the sophistication of this attack and the complexity of that. Doesn't that stun you some?
It really does. I mean, just what was mentioned by, you know, by Robert Hager, the fact that undoubtedly, you know, I can't see any U.S. commercial airline pilot flying their plane directly into an obstacle like that. Undoubtedly, there was, you know, somebody at the controls that was able to guide the plane there. That in itself is kind of scary. I told you earlier about the fact that it bothers me that with all the devices we have against hijackers, that hijacking can still take place on this scale and organized in that fashion. That causes me concern. I certainly agree with what Senator McCain said about the fact that, you know, many years ago, we abandoned human intelligence. The attitude was that only bad guys have spies, and good guys don't need spies, and we put satellites in the air, and we put a huge amount of investment into technical intelligence. At the same time, we dismantled human intelligence. I don't know what the status of that is today, but we damn sure need to get somebody inside these organizations. I would tell you that...
General, I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment because we're looking at some scenes that we have not yet had an opportunity to see. It does look like a nuclear winter in lower Manhattan. It is one of the most vital areas anywhere in the world, obviously. The home of the financial markets, the World Trade Center, lots of residences. There's been a real revival down there in recent years, and it has a great gray pall of dust and smoke and debris. And of course, overlaying all of that is the psychological effect of knowing that there could be a casualty list in terms of fatalities that could go into the thousands.
Yeah. I mean, Pearl Harbor, we lost 2,400. And, you know, when you hear the numbers today, it's hard to believe that we're not going to greatly exceed that number.
And as I pointed out earlier, in Pearl Harbor, it was a military attacking a military installation. This was the use of innocent people in commercial airliners to attack other innocent people in New York. There was one military target, obviously the Pentagon. You can see, if you're looking at this with me, General, the extent of the damage in lower Manhattan.
Yeah, unbelievable. Unbelievable. And you know, it's the natural inclination is, okay, we got to hit somebody back. And in this case, what's going to, you know, be even more frustration to the national psyche is you can't hit back. You know, you don't, who you're going to hit at this stage of the game.
Yep. Thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf. We'll ask you to stand by. We'll be coming back to you. This is as effective as a bomb being dropped there. There were two bombs in effect, commercial airliners flown into those two buildings, and they came down. We presume because of the initial explosion, there may have been secondary explosions as well that were detonated in the building by these terrorists. Robert Harper was one of those who was in the area when all of this occurred. Mr. Harper?
Yes. Tom, how are you today?
Tell me where you were when the first plane flew into the first building.
I was down below the World Trade Centers. I was arriving at work just a little late, and the first plane had crashed into the building, so there were many people, you know, sort of standing around. There were EMS workers running around as well, and you could see the second plane coming around, and everyone sort of pointing up, and then that second plane just crashed into the building.
And what about people who were trying to get out of the building? We had one report of bodies falling through the air and people jumping from windows. Did you see any of that?
Absolutely, absolutely. It was a very traumatic day, I think, having seen that, because where the initial explosion was, there was a lot of black smoke coming out of around, I believe it was around the 78th floor, and you saw people jumping for their lives out of the 78th floor of the World Trade Center. Smoke everywhere, fire everywhere, and people were continuing to jump out of the 78th floor. So people began to run away because once the second explosion happened, the debris that was caused by that began to fall everywhere, and everybody just started running toward the mayor's office. You know, I began to run toward the Woolworth building, which was close to that. And then as I got closer to that, I realized if, you know, the top of the World Trade Center hit the Woolworth building, that building too would be affected, and it might also fall down.
Did you have a sense right away that these buildings could come down?
Not initially. For about 15 minutes or so, people only thought, they couldn't really tell what had happened. And only after the second plane hit did people realize that, this is probably something that was orchestrated. And so then people initially who had, been trying to go back to the scene and try to help people realized that another plane had hit the building. And that's when people said, look, this can't have been a mistake.
Where are you now?
I'm outside of the emergency room at Presbyterian Hospital. I've just been released for smoke inhalation. I've been in the hospital there. They rushed me to the hospital, not too long after that because the black soot and everything that was associated with the building. I mean, heavy black smoke engulfed the entire financial district. From 9 o'clock onward, and we were sitting on the side of the road. EMS workers were there administering oxygen to people, thinking that everything was okay. And then as they began to realize that the explosion might have caused so much trauma to both the World Trade Center that they would fall, then everybody just began to run because they saw that the building itself was actually going to fall. So all of the people that had gone to help out were then put in double danger because you were then running, and the building literally came and fell over the entire financial district area. It was a complete nightmare. Black smoke everywhere. People were running toward the Brooklyn Bridge, running away from the mayor's office, afraid that the falling part of the World Trade Center would hit other buildings, and that would cause a topple effect.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harper, and thank God you're okay, and I hope that you'll be able to deal with all of this. We do appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a real mess, and I can't, coming back in the ambulance, somebody said, one of the things that they remembered, thinking about is the date today is September 11th, so 9/11. So, it's something that can't really go without notice, is that this was completely planned, completely orchestrated. Whoever did this has been planning this obviously for a very long time.
Thank you very much, Robert Harper, who was one of the survivors who was just a little bit late to work this morning, but then got caught in the devastating attack on the Twin Trade Towers. It's hard for me to overstate to people who are unfamiliar with New York just how dynamic that area is in terms of people coming and going. The two towers are 110 stories high, or they were. 20 to 50,000 people would work in them at any one time. It's just a few blocks from the stock market and from many of the principal banks in America, to say nothing of residential areas. And we will not know for some time what the death toll is there, to say nothing of the number of people who have been injured, so many of them with burns. Let's go to Washington now, and NBC's Washington Bureau Chief, Tim Russert. Tim, give us the state of play in the nation's capital right now. We know that the White House and the State Department and CIA have been evacuated. Dennis Hastert has been removed. Where is Dick Cheney at this hour? Do we know?
Tom, he is in a secure location. They won't tell us exactly, but I do know that he is there with his top-level aides. We have heard from some of those people. He has been in constant communication with the President of the United States and the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. Tom, I've been speaking to people in the intelligence and law enforcement community, in and out, those who have served, those who are serving now. No one is the least bit surprised that there was a terrorist attack on the shores of America. Every person, to a man and woman, absolutely stunned, not only by the magnitude, but by the precision of this attack. They are absolutely convinced that there's only a few cells that could possibly have done this. And this is quite interesting because I didn't realize it until it was pointed out to me. Every one of the 4 hijacked planes that Bob Hager talked to you about was bound for California. In the words of this high-ranking official, the bastards knew they all had a plane full of fuel for the maximum impact upon collision. There is, in my experience in Washington, unprecedented anger here, but no one knows how or where to channel it. Right now, the situation is a bit chaotic. Communication is difficult, but the Bush administration is underscoring that the President is in charge, in command, in constant communication, and will bring these people to justice. They just know it's going to take a long, long time.
Tim, it's also going to be a test of the political maturity, if you will, of Washington. It's a city that has been so riven by what many would describe as petty political disputes. But this is one nation on this day.
Suddenly, the Social Security lockbox seems so trivial, Tom. One official said to me, Tim, your life is going to change, but more important, your son's life is going to change forever. America will never be the same after September 11th, 2001. The levels of security, heightened tension, the way we look at each other and look at our institutions will in fact be altered. That will bring some gratitude, if you will, to the terrorist. And that's why we as a nation, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, are, as they talk with one another today, are absolutely unified in their attempt to strike back, but also try to put salve on the national psyche so we don't become an armed camp resisting an enemy we really can't identify and never know when is striking.
Because the consequences psychologically for this country are every bit as great as they are physically for America as well. It is worth pointing out, I suppose, that we all breathed a great sigh of relief when the Cold War came to an end with the collapse of communism. And yet there was nothing as devastating as this for this country during that long, cold twilight that we faced down communism in Moscow with its considerable nuclear arsenal, which it still has in place, obviously.
You know, Tom, it's a very important point because all during this past few weeks, the debate about missile defense systems, many people were saying publicly, even those proponents or the detractors, well, you know, we're a long way from research on this, but there is a potential threat of a rogue nation launching a missile or an accidental launch from Russia or China modernizing their force. But everyone kept saying the true risk, the real risk is terrorist attack. And we plain don't know how to defend ourselves. But again, and let me underscore this, people are absolutely stunned, disbelieving that something so well coordinated, something is with a tick-tock like this, 4 hijackings within a matter of an hour, and then being able to take those very planes and drive them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And there is growing suspicion, Tom, here, that the plane that landed, it crashed in Pennsylvania, was most likely headed for the Capitol or White House. That's the operating theory of many of the people I've spoken to today.
Thank you very much, NBC's Tim Russert. The equation has changed for all of us personally and professionally in the course of the last several hours, and we'll be dealing with this for a long, long time. But first we want to take you through the eyewitness accounts of people who were witness to what happened here on a very sunny early fall morning in New York today. Some of the eyewitnesses.
I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything like this. Saw a lot of people die. Nothing this devastating.
We carried a bunch of people that we found laying in the debris. There was complete darkness. We stumbled over some people. We picked them up and carried them across the street.
You could hear the rumbling. When you looked up, you could see the top of the building just crumbling.
Then there was the haunting story from an eyewitness that we heard from a few moments ago of people in wheelchairs who were unable to get out of the building as he ran down the stairs, and he was obviously overcome with emotion as he described that for us. We don't have any numbers for you. We're trying to be as circumspect as we can be. All public officials are saying that they expect the final death toll to be horrendous, but this business of determining how many people are still in the rubble will take many, many hours, if not days, to determine. Here is a quick summary of what we have been through today in this country on the 11th of September, the year 2001. At 8:42 this morning, first one plane that had been hijacked crashed into the World Trade Center. Then, not too long after that, a second plane. About an hour later, the Pentagon was attacked by a hijacked airliner, and then came word that another hijacked airliner had crashed outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When we saw the first reports and witnessed, those of us who live in New York, of the World Trade Center being hit by an airplane, at first all of us thought, I'm sure, that it had to be some kind of a terrible accident. And then when we heard that a second plane, and you could see it flown deliberately into the World Trade Center, the horror of this terrorist war began to unfold, and it continues to unfold here now almost 5 hours later. And we'll be continuing to cover this across America and in the nation's capital. NBC's Pat Dawson has been not too far from the World Trade Center throughout most of the day, where it has been chaotic and terrifying. Pat?
Tom, as you point out, we try not to exaggerate very much in this circumstance, and yet in many ways it's hard not to exaggerate just the things we have been seeing and the things that we have been told. I think it is fair to say that the task that now confronts rescue workers here is Herculean, a very, very difficult task, and it is of two parts. It has been about 3 hours since what we might call the last catastrophic incident in a morning of catastrophes. That is since the North Tower of the World Trade Center, which used to stand behind me just about 10 blocks south right below there. It used to tower above the buildings, which you can see, and obviously it is no longer there, nor is the South Tower. 3.5 hours since that happened. There have been no catastrophic incidents since then, but it has affected the rescue effort clearly because they are afraid of what could happen, what still might happen, since there were a sequence of catastrophes, if you will. That has made the rescue very, very difficult. At this point, we are being told unofficially that there may be as many as 200 to 300 rescue workers who are actually down there. We have seen pictures of some of them. They are down around the base of this building. They are beginning the, again to use that word, Herculean task of trying to find the people who might be alive in that debris. We know that there are a great number of people who are dead in there, unquestionably. What they are hoping to find is survivors, and at this point they really can't speculate on how many there are, how many there could be, and I don't think it really serves us at this point to speculate on the numbers that it could be. One of the tasks, though, is to try to get this rescue effort in its entirety going, and as you can see behind me down here, there are probably hundreds of New York City and New York State and federal rescue people who are involved, fire, police, emergency service, quite a few. In addition to those, the task is certainly aided by the American Red Cross's disaster relief teams. They are here on the scene. This is Frank Donahue, who is with the American Red Cross. Frank, tell me first of all, as you start out here, what is it you're trying to do?
Well, our immediate purpose is to kind of assess what role the Red Cross can play initially, and certainly it's to help the emergency medical people that are here provide any kind of relief and support we can for them. People being evacuated from neighborhoods need a place to go, and the Red Cross is setting up service centers and shelters. There's one at Grand Central Station and Penn Station. And then the blood supply, making sure we have a safe blood supply, not only here but throughout the country.
Do you have any idea, have you heard, how many casualties have been dealt with so far?
No, I have not. I'm sorry, I have not heard that.
Is it now part of your task, though, is also to provide blood supplies? Obviously, that will be needed in huge
Absolutely, and people throughout the country are responding. They should call 1-800-GIVE-LIFE. It's important to know that this incident, and you know, there's blood needed here in Altoona, there's blood needed all throughout the country that's been affected by this disaster. Mm-hmm. Another part is people that are moving around, are traveling today. No airport in this country is open, and so Red Cross volunteers are in every airport providing assistance to families. Families are calling the Red Cross here in New York as they are calling their local Red Cross to try to communicate and find the well-being of people that were in this building, as well as people in the other affected areas. So
you were also telling me about grief counseling and dealing with people who've been traumatized around the country, maybe at other airports.
Absolutely. Boston, for example, LAX, where those airplanes were coming from and headed to, we have Red Cross mental health worker volunteers there that are providing assistance to families. And again, that's happening throughout the country where people have been affected by this disaster. Here in New York alone, the Greater New York Red Cross has had lots of experience at the World Trade Center a number of years ago. Today, there's about 1,200 local Red Cross volunteers here in New York providing food and shelter, direction, and support to people that are incredibly affected by this incident.
And how many Red Cross workers do you think around the country?
Oh, a number of thousand, a couple thousand for sure. I know in Philadelphia, where I came from, we're on standby working with emergency management. It's the same thing in every major metropolitan area that Red Cross workers work closely with emergency management.
Frank, thank you so much for taking some time out. We appreciate it. That was Frank Donahue, the American Red Cross. Tom, that brings you pretty much as much information as we have here in what remains a fairly chaotic situation. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Pat Dawson. As the shock begins to wear down, we're going to all of us are going to have our patience tested as well as we await these reports. We'll try to deal with it as factually as we possibly can. It does now appear that the wave of attacks is over. We could not be certain of that just a few hours ago, as there were these reports of planes that were still in the air, some that had been hijacked, and their destinations were uncertain at that time. This is a live picture of Lower Manhattan, missing two of its most familiar profiles, obviously. The twin trade towers of the World Trade Center, iconic buildings here in New York, really representing, symbolic, if you will, of the enormous economic strength of this country. They sustained an attack in 1993. They were reopened. The country came back from that, and we went about our merry way again, thinking that in Fortress America, this couldn't possibly happen, but of course it has. Neil Livingston is one of the most widely recognized experts on international terrorism. Mr. Livingston, we keep coming back to the same issue. This was a very sophisticated attack. This was not just a lone suicide bomber of some kind. 4 hijacking simultaneously. Obviously, someone in the cockpit who knew how to get the plane to the targets that they wanted to get them to. And it had to have happened over a long period of time, and they were all transcontinental flights loaded with fuel.
Tom, this is our worst-case nightmare scenario, the one that we've hoped would never happen, and that would be a multiplicity of targets with a multiplicity of highly sophisticated bombs, in this case aircraft, and very symbolic targets. And so this great deal of thought went into this, a great deal of time and money. This kind of thing doesn't happen overnight. So we can anticipate that maybe a year or more was probably devoted to planning this attack, and there may be others coming.
Mr. Livingston, I remember that the FBI has been concerned for some time about the number of cells harboring terrorists in America that have been growing. Is that true?
Well, there clearly are a number of people in the United States that have been the beneficiaries of our relatively liberal immigration policy that have hidden within various communities here and have expressed very strong anti-American sentiments. Whether that can be translated into terrorism at this point is open to question. I would suspect that what we will see in this case are perhaps foreign nationals who have arrived in the United States strictly to carry out this mission, hijack these aircrafts, and take them to their targets. Very similar to what we saw in that millennial potential attack when a man was arrested at the border in Washington State who was going to carry out bombing attacks in the United States. He was an outsider who had been sent here to do that.
All right, Neil Livingston, thank you very much. I also have on the phone now Anthony Lake, Tony Lake, a former National Security Advisor to President Clinton, who's been a longtime student of the prospect of terrorism in this country, recently wrote a riveting fictional account of the various scenarios that the United States may have to deal with. But even in your most wildest imaginative days, Tony, you could not have anticipated something like this.
No, it's terrible. It's hard to say you can be lucky in any respect in something in such a catastrophe. But one of the great dangers still lurking out there is that it could have involved some kind of weapon of mass destruction.
But at the same time, it's hard to understate the amount of damage that has been done here physically and certainly in terms of loss of life. When you have an institution like the Pentagon attacked, the World Trade Center is attacked, and the plane that went to Pittsburgh might have been headed for the Capitol or the White House. For God's sakes.
No, this is terrible. As I said, a catastrophe. Clearly a very sophisticated terrorist attack. Our intelligence community has headed off some in the past year or two. Their ability to evade our usual intelligence gathering methods in order to pull this off is extraordinary. And one question now we need to focus on is not only why did this happen, but where do we go from here?
Well, short term, if you were the National Security Advisor now back in your old office in the White House, what would be your recommendations in terms of a suppression of some of our normal liberties that we have in this country?
Well, we mustn't defeat our liberties in trying to defend them. I think what I would be urging now is, first of all, of course, get all the information we can immediately while dealing with the human dimensions of this catastrophe. And then thinking ahead, I think there are 3 fronts we have to act on. One, there must be, once we have identified the source of this, there must be an American response to this of some kind. Secondly, I hope that this will encourage us to even think in new ways about the nature of our security threats and increase our preparations, for example, for the Coast Guard in defending our ports against possible incidents like this, customs, the immigration and...
These people work for months in advance. This is not a response, let's say, to recent events in the Middle East. This is something that was in the planning for many, many, many months.
Yeah, this is a terrible wake-up call for America. So many times we're lulled into the impression that far-off events don't have an effect on us in this country, or when there is a shooting at the CIA, as there was a few years ago, or when we had the bombing of the World Trade Center. Those trials went on, didn't generate a lot of attention. But, Andrea, let's talk for just a moment, if we can, about foreign policy in the United States, about what was on the agenda before this day, President was going to China in October. The UN meeting will be coming up in the fall. How will all this be affected?
Well, all of these events will be affected in extraordinary ways. We had already seen that economic and global meetings could no longer be held without not only the threat of protests, but without massive protests interrupting the schedule of international gatherings. The UN meetings in New York in September were already going to be very, very difficult to conduct, always have been, as you know. But now it is difficult to imagine how the president can travel safely, how other officials can gather for these international meetings without such an extraordinary degree of protection that the meetings cannot be held as originally envisioned and cannot be held really very effectively. We've seen not only the comments from Europe, but we've seen comments from the top leaders in China and elsewhere, all government leaders horrified by what has happened here in the United States. But this really will change us in profound ways. You and Tim Russert were talking about the psychological effects. We thought after the embassy bomb attacks, when airport security was stepped up so importantly, that we were in a new world. But now we've seen, much to the shock of most Americans, that we are vulnerable to hijackings. We thought that hijackings were events of the 80s domestically here in the United States, not of the late 90s and turn of the century. So this is really a new world as far as our own sense of vulnerability, especially as we travel.
Thank you very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. We're told now by the FAA that the ground stop, that is all flights in this country, commercial flights and other private aircraft, have been grounded until at least noon tomorrow. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager, who's been monitoring the situation for us at the FAA. Bob?
Right, Tom. It's all domestic flights, all commercial domestic flights.
Okay.
The prohibition on takeoffs and landings.
We are about to begin listening in on a press conference being held by Los Angeles County Sheriff Lee Baca. Let's go to him right now.
First of all, Chief Mike Brown from the California Highway Patrol, Chief Brown. Also from the Los Angeles County Fire Department, Chief P. Michael Freeman, Chief Freeman.